in, and I'll turn it over to Congresswoman Slotkin first.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a topic that I feel very passionate about for a whole bunch of reasons, both personal and professional. The topic that we're talking about today is, burn pit legislation that we're introducing. It's really a part of a bigger conversation that we're starting to have on the Veterans Affairs Committee around toxic exposure. And while some may be super familiar with this, I think there's a whole community that's very focused on some of the things that our servicemen and women are exposed to that affect their health in really detrimental ways when they wake up and find themselves out of the service and having strange ailments, rare ailments at earlier than normal ages. And for those who may not be super familiar with burn pits, I think of burn pits as this generation's Agent Orange. It's exposure to something, particularly in areas that are combat zones where we're dealing with conflicts, and where, for those who don't know, when we're overseas in one of these places and we're not, for instance, at Germany at a base or something, we burn everything. And I mean everything. And I know that lots of folks who are on the screen here are willing to speak to that issue. This issue is personal to me in particular because I served 3 tours alongside the military as a CIA officer in Iraq, and the burn pits were ever present. I mean, I can't think of a day in my 3 tours that I wasn't smelling particularly noxious fumes. And by the time I ended my 3rd tour, and when my husband was coming home from his tour, was an Army colonel at the time, they were testing everyone for some really strange eye infections. We had a whole rash of strange ailments that by the end of my 3rd tour, they were testing everybody for before you went back home. So this burn pit legislation is part of this larger piece of landmark toxic exposure legislation that we are working on in the Veterans Affairs Committee, and that I had the opportunity to engage VA Secretary McDonough on when he came in front of our committee. And the good news is that the VA knows that they have an issue with toxic exposure, and they're at least willing to work with us on figuring out how to craft that. So just to review the bidding again, a burn pit is basically a designated area on or near a military base where you burn waste. And that means everything from human waste, medical waste, plastics, batteries. I've heard of all kinds of fuels being burned in the burn pits, just literally anything that needs to be disposed of by the US military. The practice is particularly common in places that are war zones, as we said. Think Iraq and Afghanistan, but also think places like Somalia, where Dr. Shaner served. It's not exclusive to the big headline makers. It has to do with the austerity of the location and the infrastructure at that location. So smoke from these burn pits literally contain toxins and chemicals, and service members, depending on where you serve and for how long, could be exposed to that 24 hours a day nearly for your entire tour. Many veterans are coming home and experiencing illnesses, sometimes strange and sort of unexpected illnesses because of that exposure, and have critically been unable to access healthcare and benefits from the VA. So that's why earlier this month, Congressman Meijer and I introduced the Veterans Burn Pit Exposure Recognition Act. I had to read that one. So in its most simplistic form, it's going to make it easier for veterans to cut through the red tape that's been complicating this process for a very, very long time. So right now in the VA system, the burden of proof to show that toxic exposure has led to health issues rests on the veteran. It forces the veteran, the very person who's experiencing these health problems, often acute health problems, it forces them to provide evidence that they were exposed while serving. So the bill we've introduced formally concedes that service members in certain locations, literally a list of countries, were exposed to a host of chemicals from toxic burn pits during their time of service. removing that burden of proof from the veterans seeking care. And my understanding is Mr. Learman, who's on the screen with us and has generously agreed to join us, is the originator of the very concept of concession, which is a great asset to us. So just to give you a sense of the problem, from June 2007 to December 2020, we had 13,000 veterans file burn pit related claims, but less than 3,000 of them were approved. And I think that this is the kind of thing that is vastly underreported. Veterans do not either do not know or are unwilling to cut through that red tape or attempt to in order to make that claim. So they're just simply dissuaded from even engaging with the VA on this. And the bottom line is you shouldn't have to be fighting the VA at the exact moment that you are fighting for your life in this illness that you're dealing with. So the bill does not solve the whole problem, but it is an essential first step in simplifying this process and making sure our veterans can get the care that they need. We have some really wonderful guests today who'll be sharing their own stories. And after we hear from Congressman Meijer, we'll turn to them, but they include Dr. Bob Shaner. He's a longtime public educator, former police officer, and for this conversation, most importantly, former Marine who served in Somalia and the Persian Gulf. He's been a tremendous advocate for Mid-Michigan's veterans. And on a personal note, I'm thrilled that Dr. Shaner, because of his engagement on this issue, is going to be my guest tonight at the President's virtual address to Congress. So I'm thrilled to have him here. And I know we also have Mr. Shane Learman, who's a real advocate. I'll let him introduce himself when it comes to it. He is testifying on these issues literally in real time and represents disabled veterans across the country. So let me now turn to Peter Meijer to give his opening comments.
Thank you, Alyssa. So I represent Michigan's 3rd Congressional District, but before I got into office, I was most recently chairman of the board of Student Veterans of America, and I'm also an Iraq War veteran myself. And as Alyssa mentioned, anyone who served overseas understands what burn pits are. There was a day where I woke up on a small joint Iraqi base on the outskirts of Baghdad. I thought our building was on fire, and it was just the Iraqis dumping a bunch of plastics into a 55-gallon drum outside our window and lighting that on fire to dispose. And that's from the smallest bases to the very large ones where there would be an acre large area that would just be smoldering to get rid of those various debris and refuse. This has been something that's been a marker of our more recent conflicts. And one of the things that I think is underappreciated, and Alyssa mentioned this talking about Agent Orange, is just how long it often takes for us to acknowledge that these are service-connected issues and service-connected disabilities. With Agent Orange and that dioxin exposure, it took decades for the VA and DOD to finally turn around and say, listen, we understand that there's a burden on us to treat these service-connected issues. But those decades were years that were spent without being able to have access to the medical care or to have that early intervention that could have made a real dramatic and lasting difference in the lifespan of those veterans. And so this is, as Representative Slotkin mentioned, it's a first step, right? There's a broader comprehensive package of bills that we hope this will add to, but trying to peel back that burden on the service member to prove the connection, to be able to prove that the toxins that may have contributed to their ailment were present at that burn pit, that is going to help us stem that tide of disapprovals of claims. But more importantly, making sure that as we go forward, that the VA and DOD are not caught in an inherently reactive mindset every step of the way, where the burden falls on service members who may be chatting in a Facebook group and saying, hey, are you suffering the same things I am? And noticing above average and above early degrees of exposure to these issues. And that is something that I really hope that the VA and DOD take heart in, because it's simply unacceptable that we have far too many of our service members coming down with ailments, far earlier than they should, at far greater rates than they should, and the DOD and VA trying to wash their hands of it. So I'm proud to support this legislation, again, as the first step to getting that broader presumption of care, but really making an impactful difference in the lives of our veterans and service members, because these are our friends. These are folks that we served with, who've served our country, who have put themselves in harm's way, and who are working to make sure that we are taking care of them, of those who have borne the battle, and maintaining that legacy and that promise to future generations. So with that, Alyssa, I'll throw it back to you to introduce some of our panelists and hear their remarks.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Next, we're going to turn to Jared Enox. He's a resident of Clarkston, so my district. I'm here in Holly. He's just down the road, 10, 12 miles, right here in mid-Michigan. He's a veteran of the war in Iraq, and he knows firsthand the health consequences that veterans are struggling with due to toxic exposure. His story is really compelling. And with that, Jared, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Slotkin and Congressman Meijer, for inviting me today. My name is Jared Enox. I'm a veteran of the United States Army Reserves for 13 years, residing in Clarkston, as she said. Joined back 2007, got deployed to Joint Base Balad, Iraq, about March 2010 to April 2011. I signed the 298th Support Maintenance Company, the 103rd Expeditionary Support Command under the 25th Field Artillery Regiment. I worked directly around open burn pits at our base, discarding trash, waste, equipment, anything that we deemed that wasn't sellable to locals or to be sent home. It was mostly incinerated using jet fuel as a catalyst. That was just to keep the temperatures high enough to more or less melt anything. These pits, that was on my base, was about 10.5 acres in size. It burned 24 hours a day, all 13 months that I spent in Iraq. It's an overwhelming smell of burning plastic and jet fuel. It was just almost nauseating and debilitating, and on any type of exercises that you tried performing. So you could smell it pretty much the entire time you were there. Day before we left country, that was when I was giving my burn pit letter exposure to be put in my medical records, just stating that the environmental impacts and exposures of the health risks that we had been exposed to. It also had a date on it dating back to 2006. We had not been properly warned about these health risks and exposures until we had left country, in my case. In the years since I returned home, my health declined significantly. I've had neuropathy, vitamin deficiencies such as cachexia. I've had low blood cell, white blood cell counts. I've had myocardial ischemia, colitis, muscle spasms. I have an Alevmy book. It's about 1,000 pages that I've gone through private doctors to figure all this out. I've tried over the last 10 years to get coverage and care that I needed to the VA, but it never felt like the underlying health issues I've had were addressed. Eventually, I started seeing the private doctors. Just once I showed that letter to my private doctor, he stated that I probably would need to be monitored every year to check blood work, vitals, and bodily functions to see signs of either failing or deteriorating health conditions due to the toxins and exposures that were there. Life has been hard since I've come back from Iraq. So the VA's made it much harder just trying to get any kind of recognition for this. The reality of the exposure is burn pits are just as serious of an exposure as Agent Orange. And our veterans are being left behind by the current systems. The bill that Congress Slotkin and Congressman Meijer are pushing as the first step to help hopefully fix this problem. But veterans like me are dealing with serious health issues, and we shouldn't have to battle the VA to get the coverage we need for the conditions that are resulting from toxic exposures, as well as some health screenings going forward to see the extent of the current exposures. We can't let our veterans be tied up by red tape and come home from service. We made a sacrifice and promised our women and men in uniform, providing them the care they need is an essential part of keeping a promise. If you're willing to spend this much in the military budget, at least 1/3 of it should go for treatment and care of the soldiers. they're exposed to these burn pits and the help. The Veteran Burns Pit Expose Your Act should help keep that promise. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jared. I appreciate that for that firsthand account of sort of how it works. And again, that battle as you're trying to figure out what is wrong with you, that having to battle the VA and figure that out, it just is, we all know how complicated getting access to medical care can be, but it shouldn't have to be insurmountable, basically. So I will now talk to Dr. Shaner, turn to Dr. Shaner, who I introduced briefly before, a former Marine who served in Somalia and who had really personal experience with folks that he served with. And with that, Dr. Shaner, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
4,000 more times, I'll stop doing that.
Go for it.
Thank you, Congresswoman Slotkin and Congressman Meijer, for inviting me to join you here today. I'm here as a witness and an advocate for the Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen who I served with in pre-9/11 Somalia and the Persian Gulf. We comrades know all too well the health consequences that our service members are suffering from due to toxic exposure. For some of us, like Sergeant Roy Eddington of Lexington, Kentucky, the bill we're advocating for is too late. On December 9th, 1992, my Marines and I went ashore as an element of the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit in execution of Operation Restore Hope in Mogadishu, Somalia. Shortly after landing, we initiated operations ashore that included escorting relief supplies across the Green Line in Mogadishu, the line that separated the warring factions. Our main mission was armed escort of relief supplies throughout the famine triangle. To put it mildly, we witnessed death, destruction, and human suffering that is beyond comprehension of the five senses. We were exposed to untold toxic materials, as well as the extensive use of burn pits to dispose of everything from human waste to captured arms and ammunition. Marines like Sergeant Eddington, who went into Somalia as a corporal and was promoted by the Commandant of the Marine Corps for his meritorious service, and like many others that served like him, performed their duty beyond what one could expect of the conditions that were so unimaginable. They served our country selflessly, and they deserve better. Big Roy, as most of his fellow Marines referred to him as, even 25 years later, lost his battle to a rare lung disorder and cancer on February 28, 2021. His family still waits for adjudication on his disability claim. Again, our service members deserve better. We truly appreciate the efforts of Congresswoman Slotkin and Congressman Meijer in getting them the support they earned. I say it again, the support they earned. We need the Veterans Burn Pit Exposure Act signed into law as soon as possible. It was a privilege and honor to serve with the Marines and sailors of the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit, some of whom are behind me in my backdrop, in Somalia. And I know that the soldiers and airmen who serve there with us share a similar sentiment about their comrades and their service. The Veterans Burn Pit Exposure Recognition Act is critical in recognizing our service, our sacrifice, and getting us the support that we earned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaner. Appreciate that. We will now turn to Shane Learman. He's the Deputy National Legislative Director for the Disabled American Veterans. He has been an advocate for veterans across the country for 20 years. He's also a Marine and a Nebraska native, which we will excuse him in this room of Michiganders, or this group of Michiganders. And as I mentioned, he is testifying in front of the Senate this week, at the House, I think next week, on this very issue. So with that, Mr. Learman, over to you.
Good afternoon. I'm Shane Learman, DAV's Deputy Legislative Director of Marine, DAV lifetime member, and I've been a DAV National Service Officer and advocate for over 23 years for veterans across this country. Our nation has a solemn duty to care for those suffering long-term negative health effects, especially from toxic exposures in open air burn pits during their military service. Yet, VA is currently denying 78% of all burn pit related claims. As a DAV service officer, I have assisted thousands of veterans trying to obtain their benefits due to burn pit exposure as well as other toxins. And one thing is abundantly clear. We need action now. DAV supports the Veterans Burn Pit Exposure Recognition Act, as it would concede exposure to dozens of chemicals for all veterans who served in areas where burn pits are known to have been widely used, meaning those seeking healthcare and benefits for illnesses not yet considered presumptive diseases would no longer have to provide specific evidence of their exposures. And in even certain circumstances, it will require VA to provide a medical examination with an opinion if that condition the veteran is suffering from is related to those chemicals now known in the burn pit exposure. Since 2007, DAV has been advocating for VA's recognition of burn pits and for legislation to provide access to healthcare and benefits. On behalf of DAV's over 1 million members, we thank Representative Slotkin and Representative Meijer for their leadership in this effort that will assist roughly 3.5 million affected veterans. Too often, our nation has been slow to provide these men and women with the needed health care and benefits. We look to Congress to take immediate action on the Veterans Burn Pit Exposure Recognition Act so those exposed can receive the benefits they have earned. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm very proud to be here and excited to see this issue, specifically this bill, move forward today in the Senate at a hearing and next week in the House. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shane. And just for folks' awareness, just because I thought this was an interesting data point, we listed the countries where people may have served as a way to indicate whether there should be this concession, this understanding that they were exposed to burn pits. And just to give you a sense of it, it's Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi, Oman, Qatar, Somalia, Afghanistan, Djibouti, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Yemen, Uzbekistan, and the Philippines. So it's really a much wider spectrum of folks based on their service, since we know burn pits were used regularly in all of these locations starting in 1990 and beyond. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Austin from my team to open it up to questions. Thanks again for being here, for all the media and to all of our guests. And over to you, Austin.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So at this point, if folks have questions, you can use the raise your hand function and we can unmute you to ask. All right, so first, let's go to Melissa Burke, the Detroit News.
Hi, thanks for doing this call. This is super interesting. My question was actually for Jared. I just was hoping to clarify. You mentioned that you had been trying for a decade to get coverage and care with the VA, but never felt like those medical issues were really addressed. I just wanted to clarify, are they denying, have you had a denial that they say that some of your conditions or all your conditions are not related to the burn pit exposure? Or can you talk just a little bit about how that's worked out?
As far as I haven't really gotten acknowledgement from the VA themselves for the exposures. I've had the runaround from both the Ann Arbor and Detroit VA. I said the Ann Arbor eventually told me that it was in my head. It wasn't until I see private care that I actually started getting correct diagnoses that were showing me what these symptoms could be caused from. And then once I started bringing the letter into the equation, a lot of the doctors started getting connections that these were probably toxics.
Thank you. That's helpful.
All right, so next we'll go to Leo Shane, the Military Times.
Yeah, thanks for doing this call. Congresswoman, Secretary McDonough earlier this week was asked about whether there's going to be some toxic exposure action on his behalf or what he can do. And he seemed to indicate that he's waiting for Congress, that he's encouraging people to keep filing their claims. But but they're still reviewing things. You seem more optimistic. Do you feel like you've got a partner in this in VA, or do you feel like they're still dragging their feet on this issue?
Well, listen, I mean, there's no way that this is going to be a waving of the wand, or else we would have done it a long time ago. I asked Secretary McDonough this directly in our hearing when he came in front of the committee, and he stated then that he was willing to work with us. And the fact that they're sending senior level witnesses to our hearing next week to discuss this, I think is important. And they need us. They can't do it through unilateral action on their own. Obviously, anyone who's at the head of the VA has to think about a myriad group of veterans. They can't just think about any one issue. But he and I have had both public and private conversations about this, and I know him to be sympathetic, and I consider him a partner in this effort, which I think is important. I've personally invited him to come to Michigan to talk to folks about this issue, to visit a state that frankly doesn't have active duty military bases, where our veterans have a much higher suicide rate than the national veteran average, and where the average veteran is pretty far from the flagpole and from that community. I want him to hear directly from veterans who aren't, living right outside a base, so that he can talk about these issues, but also about things like suicide, things like access to services. So, he's been amenable. And an interesting data point is that the spokesman for the VA, Sean Turner, is a resident of Michigan's 8th District. He lives in East Lansing. And we just had coffee this past week to talk about what we can do together on, frankly, toxic exposure generally.
And just one quick question for Shane at the Legion, if I could. Shane, you referenced that 78% rejected rate. That came up, Secretary McDonough said he thinks that it's lower than that number, but he hasn't provided another one. What's your source on that?
Thanks, Leo. Our source on that was information released directly by DA last year. And actually recently that information, to your point about what Secretary McDonough said, we did receive some information recently that confirms those numbers to be roughly around 77.5%, 78%. And I believe that information will be discussed further at the hearing today.
All right, great, thanks.
Any other questions before we wrap things up?
Going once, going twice. Guys are an easy group.
It looks like we are in good shape. So we will leave it there. Congresswoman Slotkin, Congressman Meijer, and Jared, Dr. Shaner, and Shane, thank you all so much for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your interest.
Thank you all.
Thank you.